afternoon. Hello. Good afternoon. I'm quickly going to sit and do a long waffly podcast. No, it's not going to be waffly. It's going to be directional. And I am going to talk to you about specific things associated with booking a sign language interpreter. I am off on my holidays, guys. So this is very quick. And I'm not going to whap an interpreter there. I'm going to use a different form of communication called SSE, Sign Supported English. Now, with Inadequate Mother, I'm going to take this hat off. Squeaky chair. With this podcast, it's really about an experiment, kind of testing what accessible content looks like. And it has to be diverse in order for it to reflect the diversity of communication. So I will have deaf guests on where we both sign. I will have coders on. Maybe I talk and the coder signs. Last week I had a coder on and she wanted to sign and I didn't allow her, but I should have, because there's no one way in which sign language communication looks. And if anything, this channel can reflect the diversity of communication. And also, just to claim, like, I am an interpreter, but I make mistakes. You should never absorb a person's sign language and say, that's the sign I'm going to use for that word, and then think that you've learned a sign. Learn from a professional teacher and do a course. Level 1, level 2, level 3. Today's episode, I am talking about the different places you work as an interpreter, where you should book an interpreter, who's responsible. It's often asked, and we are not fed up, but we as interpreters end up becoming the educators that say, right, you need to do this and this. So hopefully I'm going to give you some insight into what's the situation here in the UK. Because what should happen isn't necessarily what happens. I'm often asked, where do you work? But the reality is everywhere. Me personally, I don't do police or court or any kind of like legal bookings. I just avoid them, and that's because it's not appropriate with the fact that I'm in social media. There's medical appointments. A deaf person has the right to an interpreter. Now, that's maybe widely known now that sign language has recently become a legal language, but I remember having to tell the doctor, no, like, you are responsible for booking an interpreter. They would tell the patient, bring your interpreter or bring your family member. No. They are British citizens. They can access services in their first language, British Sign Language. So it is definitely, and we all know how doctor receptionists can be. So I have had many conversations with doctor receptionists, but now I have seen over the years, I've been working how many years? Probably, I'm going to say 13 years I've been working as an interpreter, and it's worlds apart compared to way back then when I would see doctor receptionists arguing with me about booking an interpreter. Generally, now people are aware that deaf have a right to an interpreter, but unfortunately, the lack of information available combined with the lack of interpreter means that receptionists just really, they struggle to book an interpreter, and that means that it affects a deaf person's access to medical treatment, advice, appointments. And one of the difficulties with medical appointments, there's a lot of areas where I can be booked directly and I'll invoice and they'll pay me. But with medical appointments, it all has to go through NHS. So they have pre-approved contracts with specific agencies. That can be difficult. So a lot of the time, the doctors has a certain list of agencies they need to use. All places of work should have a policy and procedure set out showing where and how they book interpreters. The National Register for Interpreters is called NRCPD. If you look at their website, most interpreters are registered. That covers their insurance. They are a body that has a complaint procedure. So if there's an interpreter and a deaf person wants to complain, and all your qualifications can be seen. So that's really important that that's utilised. There's also Visual Language Professionals, the LP, body of interpreters also. Most places will only use interpreters that are registered. My qualifications are checked, and it is best practice to use a registered sign language interpreter. That being said, there's also ASLI, which is the Association of Sign Language Interpreters. Now, I have to log my continuous professional development points. And every year with NRCPD, able for me to receive my registration badge, I have to log a specific number of CPD hours. So I log in and I tell them how I'm continuously professionally developing, because I'm a sole trader. I am a solo person. I could potentially not meet another professional for 1 year. So it's important that I'm connecting with the community and developing and brushing up on my skills continuously. Now, where I might find these ways of learning and developing is a organisation called ASLI, and they do lots of CPD courses because putting that aside, those are the different registration bodies. Now, where do you see interpreters working? We've done medical, we know that's obvious. Now, I myself don't work with court or any kind of legal systems. I decided that I'm out of that because I am so into social media, it's not appropriate. So we pick and choose the areas we want to work. That being said, one of the most common kind of bookings is referred to as ATW, access to work. That means that you, as an interpreter, can work wherever deaf are working. So you could be with a social worker, a doctor, you could be with a nurse, you could be with, a warehouse operative, you could be just anything, literally anything. You can be anywhere. If you're an interpreter trainee and you like having diversity in your day, then this is the job for you for definite, because literally no day is the same. It's amazing. I love it. I never get bored. I love diversity. Now, if you're a person that prefers routine and the same thing every day, because don't get me wrong, it disappoints me that I don't have kind of one-to-one relationships with regular people I see at the office, or I've never gone to a Christmas party, but that's my fault actually, because there is the Association of Sign Language Interpreters have a Christmas party now. But yeah, that kind of work-life friendships you miss out on. However, yes, but it does mean that you can kind of pick, if you find a deaf person who's working in an area that you like, that's good. Like a dancer or an artist or a photographer or an actor. Like, honestly, it's so wide, the potential of where you can work. It's fantastic. I love to mix it up, and that's just me. Now, I started off my career in a lot of education, and you will find interpreters working as they develop. And I think because of the sameness of education, meaning you go to class, you can, connect with the teacher and kind of develop a routine, meaning you can develop your skills higher up. But where you're just kind of thrown in at the deep end, maybe with a social worker, it's a little bit more like less controlled. So education is more of a controlled environment. However, it always confused me why we accept kind of like lower levels in education when it's the most important area of a deaf person's life. That's a question. Like, explain, like, do the maths on that, because I don't understand that. But that being said, when interpreters leave maybe university or become level 3, you can go and work as not an interpreter, it's called a CSW. So I did that. I went to colleges and I worked as a CSW. And then they changed the rules that you couldn't go and work in universities because of the kind of high level of information in lectures. You had to be a qualified interpreter, or no, a trainee interpreter or qualified interpreter, but not a level 3. But like I said, the rules regularly change, so please check and ask in your area, because also I think it's dependent on different councils, areas, availability of interpreters in your area. So I might be in workplace meetings with a deaf person. So the short answer is everywhere. Interpreters can work everywhere, and they should be everywhere because deaf people should have access everywhere. So if you think about it like that, the whole question, where do you work? Everywhere. Deaf need access everywhere. But generally, obviously, you can't have interpreters everywhere. But a deaf person's work life, a deaf person's educational life, a deaf person's health, medical life, legal, and then it is your responsibility to book an interpreter if you are an organisation of any kind, really. You have a lot of kind of interpreters standing on stage now, whether it be a conference or whether it be a concert or an information evening or a parent evening. It is every institution really has the responsibility to book an interpreter, especially if that deaf person has requested it. All organisations need to budget for accessibility. Voluntary work happens a lot in churches. Some churches will pay for interpreting because they have the budget, but I volunteered in churches and that really helped develop my skills. A church is a very forgiving audience. However, it's very difficult. And translating kind of biblical scriptures for me was a massive challenge, but it did brush up my skills a lot. But you have a big responsibility to ensure that translation of the Bible is right and that those people are absorbing the right kind of message. So again, don't put yourself in that kind of voluntary position. Just say, oh, well, I'm doing it for free. When we are interpreters or translators, we have a big responsibility because you're giving something that someone is absorbing and you have to make sure it's right. Unfortunately, you don't see much budget or support for community events such as weddings, funerals, festivals or civil ceremonies. Unfortunately, the deaf person will have to pay themselves for that. And yes, top tips on how to manage working with an interpreter, okay? So what we don't want, and this is really hard because I love people. So when I meet people, I've kind of had to develop a way of politely ignoring them because it's not about my relationship with that person. So if your colleague is deaf and they have an interpreter and you are communicating more with the interpreter than your deaf colleague, that's kind of a little bit, it's not really right. So you have to be careful of how much interaction you're having with their interpreter. I am here only to facilitate communication between you, and me and you, we're not a thing, okay? So it's very hard because I know interpreters will kind of kick it off, have a relationship, and you can't stop that sometimes, but you do have to be aware, it's just politeness. Please, when you see a deaf person with an interpreter, be conscientious of where that interpreter is going to stand. Now, they need to see you. Now, the interpreter needs to see the sign language of the deaf person, but the deaf person also has to see your face. So it's really important. I cannot believe the most intellectual doctors have a real problem with me. They'll have 2 chairs there for their patients and 1 chair there for them. And if I take the chair and put it next to the doctor, some doctors will kick up a fuss and like, don't sit next to me. I'm the doctor. You're going to infect me. Stay away. Like, no, mate. No. He needs to see you and me. And honestly, it can be embarrassing. Anyway, so don't say, can you tell him? No. Just look at the deaf person as though you would normally look at anyone and communicate like that, because they're looking at your lips and potentially using the sign language as backup, or they're looking at the sign language interpreter and they want to kind of check in on your facial expressions or things like that, you know. And just also be aware of the speed you're talking. So my last tip is just to be aware of kind of the time in which you're talking, the speed in which you're talking. Are you like going talking over each other? Come on, it's just, to me it's common sense, but for other people they just forget. And you just have to be aware of kind of the smoothness of a conversation, because if you're swapping and changing context, it's very hard for a deaf person to understand. And you have to also be aware of kind of the time in which you're talking and allowing that deaf person to have an eye break, but also the interpreter to have a break of their brain, because you will see smoke coming from an interpreter's brain. We are taking in information at the same time and processing it and producing information at the same time. Whilst hearing, we're producing. It's weird, and our brains do crazy things, but it will break. I have experienced brain fatigue when I'm dribbling. It's crazy. But anyway, I'm going to stop. Please connect with me on Instagram, Hayley Brown and Co. Any questions, like I said, just ask. It's my aim to create a safe space for us to raise awareness. I feel like I've waffled enough, and just comfortably talk about things, about being a mom, being an interpreter, things that I am. And then hopefully you can talk about things that you are. But what I am is someone, but at the moment, I am a woman that's going on holiday. Mwah.